Hi, I would like to invite you to listen to the conversation with Lena Dobrowolska and Teo Ormond-Skeaping. This event is accompanying their exhibition, Future Scenarios.
We meet here in this online meeting here to talk about your work. You present on the Photomonth festival in Krakow. First, I would like to introduce you to the people who will be watching us. So I'm glad that I can conduct this conversation with you. Lena Dobrowolska and Teo Ormond-Skeaping are our guests. You're an artist duo working with a combination of media, including documentary, photography, artist films, virtual reality, and installation, as it's written on the Photomonth festival website. Your practice is research-led, and since 2012, you have been working on projects concerned with climate change and the Anthropocene. But it's added here also that you prefer term Capitalocene. So maybe this is a point for our later conversation. Your works document human vulnerability to and responsibility for climate change, as well as resilience and adaptation efforts through an exploration of poverty, development, and environmental catastrophe, all as a means of envisioning speculative scenarios of climate change impacted futures. In your ongoing work, you examine the ethics and methodologies of documentary representation with specific case studies relating to climate change, development, environmental degradation, human rights, and geopolitics. And in 2016, you were awarded the Culture and Climate Change Grant and Research Residency, a joint effort of the University of Sheffield and the Open University, supported by the Jerwood Charitable Foundation and the Ashton Trust. You were the recipient of the 2019 Coalition for Art and Sustainable Development, Art and Environment Prize, Climate, Disaster and Displacement. And I will say a few words about myself. My name is Alec, because this is our first meeting and we don't know each other as well as we don't know our future audience. So my name is Aleksandra Jach. I'm a curator and facilitator. I'm working as a freelancer now. And I'm working on the environmental topics for 10 years, I think now. I started with interest in urban design, ecological urban design, and it evolved through time. And now I'm working on a film about energy transformations for Biennale Warszawa, public cultural institution based in Warsaw. So I'm really happy that I can be with you here in this conversation, because topics you touch upon in your work are really also close to me and my interests. And we will be talking about your project Future Scenarios, which had the premiere in 2019. And first thing which is really interesting for me is your collaboration. How you work as an artist duo, and who is responsible for what, and who brings what in the projects and in the methodologies of work. How do you share what has to be done?
So we have met on our undergrad degree when we were both studying in a relatively small rural art school in England, in Falmouth and Cornwall. And we were both doing photography course. So we've known each other for 3 years through that. And after that, we were romantically involved first, and we're making work separately. Was it similar type of work? I don't think it was, but we both had an interest in landscape and had very much like a field-based work. I was based in Scotland back then, and Teo was on the other end of the country in southwest England. And then we went off and did our respective MAs. Teo went to Slade in London, and I went back to Poland to study at Krakow Art Academy. And so we were just kind of doing our similar, but kind of our own explorations. And then China happened. Teo was sent on a scholarship to spend a month in Beijing. And after that, I came over and joined him, and we went to the very west of China. We flown to Urumqi, and then we kind of made slowly our way back to Beijing. And that was, I think, a 6-week visit, but we kind of considered it still being quite brief, and we were really hugely kind of impacted by the experience and what we really saw and experienced. And we came back, and after coming back, we started to make some research and looked through some material that we made there, and we kind of made like a decision that we really want to invest quite seriously in, in exploring some issues that we thought were really important, and we went back. And we went back 3 times for the overall period of 9 months. And I think because it was such a kind of mission-oriented project, we quite naturally found ourselves starting to collaborate. Is that fair to say?
Yes, but how do we actually collaborate? I think we need to explore that. Yeah. So initially we were both taking photographs. We were both working with medium format cameras, the same camera. Later, as we started to do more film work, at times one of us would be shooting film, the other one would be photographing. And the benefit of having 2 people is that you always have another partner to push you, but also another partner who's listening or thinking when you're, say, engaged with speaking to someone, they are able to record and to reflect whilst you're speaking. They're also able to carry more equipment and, most importantly, I think, push you conceptually and make you question why you're doing something and what you're doing. So as we started that process and when we came to future scenarios, we didn't really question who's pushing the button of the camera. It doesn't really matter to us who's actually the one taking the photograph or making the film. We really see ourselves as
agency,
an agency or one unit that has an output. We're not so interested in the authorship of the work, purely of the impact and success of the work.
Yes, and I think we were always multimedia, so Teo was working simultaneously with photography and moving image, but he's also doing sound work and installation. So there is always enough to, dip in and really share.
Though we do have some specialties, Lena is potentially more of the research-focused conceptual thinker, and I am the person who carries a lot of the heavy weight and it sometimes does more for me.
Yes, definitely. I think in the field work, it's like Teo is definitely the cameraman, or particularly with filming, because we're using quite heavy Steadicam equipment and kind of cinematic heavy cameras. But in terms of research, I think when we started to work with scientists and when we started to really have a very interdisciplinary research practice, it was like the residency that we did, it was really like a sort of a PhD distilled into 1 year. So there was a lot of learning and a lot of, a lot of kind of embracing of completely different disciplines. So I think it was also helpful to have two people to just kind of, exploring those subjects and fact checking and kind of science learning. And Teo is, very luckily for me, good geographer. So it's just, there's quite a lot of kind of like fact-based research that we do, really.
Can you say in a few words to our audience, what is the film about? Like 2-3 sentences.
So the Future Scenarios film explores both difficult and improving scenarios over the next 81 years. We based the film starting in about 2020 and ending in 2100. And at 4 points in the film, you are faced with 3 screens, one of which is the year increasing on the left-hand side, the center of which is a number of speculative events, and on the right-hand side you have a colored dot which ranges from yellow to dark red, which is to subjectively suggest a temperature rise, which the viewer is meant to choose themselves. And so we have these scenario events, they are completely speculative, and then after you have seen this sort of break in the film, you are then watching documentary footage and hopefully thinking about those scenarios, events, so the documentary footage becomes sort of speculative, lived experiences of these futures in different locations around the world.
How did it happen that you decided to work on future scenarios and this very specific scenarios you choose? Because one is corporate scenario, and I'm really interested to hear more from you about the selection of this 2 stories. Yeah, one is corporate, another is prepared by international institution. Yeah, so
It's a legal document. It's a policy.
Yeah.
That's really important.
So we were the whole basis of the Culture and Climate Change Future Scenarios residency was to engage with future scenarios, and we were introduced to the history of scenarios and the scenarios thinking or scenarios planning methodology through which we were challenged to work with this methodology as artists. I mean, very briefly, we can explain what scenarios are. So the term scenarios comes from a 16th century Baroque street theatre called Commedia dell'arte, in which performers would improvise a short play based around a set of props or stock characters. And then later on, this term was used by a military strategist called Herman Kahn, who is a bit like the real-life Dr. Strangelove, to describe the speculative narrative scenarios he was writing for the US military on what would happen if America got attacked by Russia with thermonuclear weapons. And so this early scenarios thinking methodology uses collective collaboration to imagine unthinkable futures, because the whole point about an unprecedented future is you can't base it on past events. So you must move beyond what's happened in the past to think about what could happen and how one would react. So what you do is you ask what if questions. So, for example, what if cars were banned? Or what if you could no longer fly? To imagine how that would shape the future, and then what that future would look like, what policies you would need to implement, what changes to society. So we, and later on, this methodology has been employed in different areas of, as you say, corporate and business strategy. So by people like Shell, who employ scenarios to look at how they may profit in the future from, say, changing energy use or the change in the demand for their product, so that they can avoid losing money, for example, by making too much oil, like we've seen happening in the COVID situation.
And I think more importantly, how to stay relevant as well for them.
Yes, but it also is being used by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in their, for example, the Paris Agreement, where they detail 5 or 6 different temperature-based scenarios which indicate what might happen if we do or don't act on climate change. So, for example, their scenarios range from an aspirational 1.5 degrees of warming to catastrophic 6 degrees of warming. And then, but you can also talk about scenarios which are not in the corporate world, which we do also work with, which are based upon, for example, degrowth or indigenous cosmologies. So while we did respond initially to those 2 scenarios, the Shell scenarios, because we were looking at how future energy use might shape our society and how the different temperature rises may shape our society, we did also work with those degrowth and indigenous cosmology futures. But really, this was a starting point, and what we focused upon was using that methodology. So all of the speculative events, apart from the very technical ones, which talk about things like peak oil or population predictions, are completely speculative based upon our what-if questions. So, for example, what if we asked what would happen if water stress in the Himalaya got very great? Would there be a conflict between China and India, for example? What would happen if the monsoon stopped? How would that impact somewhere like Bangladesh? What happens if the sea level rises?
Another example of kind of scenarios was the very kind of well-known Limits to Growth book from 1972 by a Club of Rome. So that was another example of scenarios which we're actually using in our previous project feedback loops.
So to imagine how you start the work on the future scenarios, so you had this long time of preparation, as you, Lena, said, yeah, that you work with many people, researchers, scientists, and this was intense work, as you said, a PhD in a 1 year, condensed in a 1 year. This is really interesting thing. How many things you have to learn as somebody from outside, let's say this science world, to tell a story about such a complex issue as climate change. Yeah. So you have this, you were in this really long process of preparation, and you choose the scenarios you mentioned a moment ago. What's next? What happened next? How did you choose locations? How did you choose, how did you thought about narration of a film?
So it was a little bit more mixed up than just kind of researching and then doing. We kind of did both at the same time. Because so the idea for the residency was quite interesting. It kind of explored an artist as a climate change researcher. So it really wasn't about taking research and then kind of artistically reflecting of it, on it, but it was really about kind of very proactively generating knowledge through artistic practice. What we really did is that we kind of identified areas of interest. So once we understood the scenarios methodology, then we were already kind of going into the project interested in this kind of inequality issue in climate change between global north and the global south. So we had that focus already from our previous work. And then quite naturally, we developed collaborations, mostly with researchers from the global south. And we identified the potential case studies or the locations we wanted to go through a list of countries or nations which are most vulnerable to climate change, which was compiled, I think we used the 2005 list by IIED.
Yes, a researcher called Lena Dobrowolska.
And yes, exactly. So we worked with a kind of a very esteemed researcher called Salem Ul-Haq, who's a Bangladeshi scientist. He runs his own institute, which is a International Center for Climate Change and Development, yes, in Dhaka. And we went to Dhaka, and we were actually based as researchers in his institute as we were doing the field work. And that was the kind of model that we repeated throughout the residency.
I think most importantly is that our focus changed, because when we initially started, we were purely focused on vulnerability, actually. And we thought we were just going to go and document vulnerability. And what we learned particularly through Salem Ul-Haq, was actually how the narrative of vulnerability that surrounds those nations which are most vulnerable to climate change it's outdated. Not only is it outdated, it also compounds the victimhood of those countries which are vulnerable to climate change. And what Dr. Huck and his team taught us was actually those nations which are most vulnerable are in fact most resilient. They are climate change experts. So we were challenged to come to Bangladesh not to learn about how it may be severely impacted, but what Bangladesh can teach the rest of the world about climate change. Now, this is not about how Bangladesh builds walls to stop sea level rise or how it spends lots of money on things, because this is not possible for a country like Bangladesh. It's possible for Holland, or it's possible for the UK. So we were learning a lot about sort of the use of indigenous knowledge, such as drought or salt-resistant rice strains. We also learned about things like disaster preparedness, building capacity. So, for example, Bangladesh is one, if not the most responsive countries in the world to cyclones, as we've seen with the recent cyclone Amphan. This was a Category 5 cyclone, and almost 2 million people evacuated because of the work that's been done on disaster preparedness. So people in villages, they get together, they have lessons on how to respond to the cyclone, how to identify the different warnings, and then how to organize to leave, how to move to cyclone shelters and things like that. But most importantly, we also learned about how the global south, and particularly countries like Bangladesh, are political and moral leaders when it comes to negotiations. They are the ones driving the climate negotiations towards a future which is just. They are the ones demanding and pushing the global north, the countries in the global north like the US and the UK, to act on climate change as a was, I think, the most important lesson we learned.
And that was like this.
Can you tell me more about this resilience of global South countries? Because I have to admit that this is something new for me, and I always thought that, and I read a lot of articles about, as you said, vulnerability of a global South, and I I think that it's difficult to me to understand what is this resilient of this affected by climate change countries based on. Yes, so
one of the very obvious things why they're ahead of us is that they are actually living with effects of climate change already for quite some time. So that's like one of the strongest aspects of why do they know more. Yes, just got a blank out, but
I think so. Resilience is, there are degrees of resilience. There's resilience on a personal level, then a community level, and a country level. I think on a personal level, it's difficult because resilience implies that you can deal with difficult situations. Certainly in the global south, because you've already been dealing with difficult situations. You have your whole life. In some cases, say you live in an informal settlement or a slum, you are already used to dealing with hardships which we in the West are not, which is problematic because it implies that you can take yet more hardships. I think that why the global south is exemplary is it's because it's used to innovating and acting with little resources and little financial input. So the sort of solutions which they are developing don't require more carbon, more investment, more massive social or political changes, because they are based upon social and ways of thinking which are already embedded in their communities. So it's more that their culture and ways of doing things are already better suited to how we need to adapt and change our societies in the West to mitigate climate change and to deal with it. I think a good example is how different countries have reacted during this pandemic crisis. It effectively shows how we are and going to react to climate change. A country like Vietnam, which has effectively crushed the curve with few or no deaths, did so with little resources, with an army of contract tracers, which are people, whereas America, the UK, most of Europe have struggled because, number one, we didn't listen to scientists like we're not with climate change, and we didn't want to change our way of lives. We prioritized economies rather than people. And this is effectively exactly why the Global South is better suited to adapting and dealing with climate change.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is exactly the kind of their economies, because they're still developing, they are far more agile in terms of wanting to change, wanting to decarbonize.
Or having the choice to develop in a way which is not carbon intensive.
Exactly, and the other thing that we really looked at and studied was actually the politics of the climate negotiations, and the very progressive thinking, be it about how we should look at natural disasters under loss and damage, a kind of loss of culture and language, so that the non-economic losses that will come with climate change. All these progressive kind of policies are put forward by the Global South. The degrowth thinking, the economy of care, this is all that has been already working in many, many communities in Global South, and we are only just catching up.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually experiencing crises or starting to see those inequalities in our own societies.
Mm-hmm. When I was watching your film without any reading about the context, the interviews with you, I decided just to sit and watch it and see how it works for me, and how do I feel with this story. I focused on a way how you represent the global north and south, And the one thing I noticed was that, let's say, global south, so the several countries you choose to depict in a film, were full of people, active people, yeah. So people who are doing something, who are making something, they building something, they collect something, they walk somewhere, and the contrast with and it was in a huge contrast for me with the images of I know, destroyed houses, like from I know, global north, United States probably. There were some images from demonstrations of Extinction Rebellion, of course, but somehow this like, I remember that this kind of dynamic, that we have global south full of, you know, really different activities, and global north empty, without people, like forests without any people, yeah, like this houses on the beach also empty, yeah. So yeah, I'm wondering what kind of questions you were posing to yourself when it comes to this really, how to say, difficult topic, yeah, or challenging topic, yeah. People from a global north, you deciding to make a film about planetary issues, yeah, but also about inequalities between different parts of the world and how people live and react on the climate change. What were the most difficult questions you were posing to yourself? What were the most difficult moments for you in this work on the film?
I think it's really interesting to hear your interpretation, because this power dynamic that you're describing is quite apt. Certainly politically, I'll just say this and then we can talk about the limitations, that this is exactly how it is in the negotiations. The global north, the US, the UK, Europe are dragging their heels. They are politically very passive. They want to delay things as much as possible until financially they have to do something, whereas the global south and the civil society, which builds and stands in solidarity with the global south, is incredibly active. It's the one pushing constantly. And I think it's the greatest challenges we found are all based upon power dynamics. The power dynamic of the white Western photographer and filmmaker. For Lena, I think it's a little bit more complicated, being from a country which is not ever colonized anyone. I don't think she has the same difficult position that I have as someone from a colonial country. But certainly we didn't shy away from this question of what does it mean to go and interact and film those from the global south. We actually intentionally went head on to address this issue. What does it mean? And how can the camera actually represent that power dynamic? How can it represent the behind the camera you have this protagonist who is effectively responsible for climate change, who represents white supremacy, who represents the success of corporate domination. And the way we did that was, I mean, ultimately, the film in some ways is not a success, because you have, it is not being made by those who should, from the global south, who should be representing these problems. However, it is still possible to talk about the issues, and the way we wanted to do that was through encouraging both confrontation with the camera, but also elaboration or performances for the camera. And I think it's important to mention that whenever we were working with people in the Global South, we were doing so having gained permission and acceptance of what we were doing through different community structures. So, for example, we would first approach a village leader or a community leader, having already been working with a translator and researcher who could introduce us to the community. And then once we had gained permission at the community level, we went then to the individual level. And invariably, because we came asking to learn from people, not to pre-diagnose problems or to with an agenda, we were welcomed because we were observing practices rather than dictating what should be done. I don't know if Lena wants to add anything.
Yes, I think that was the most challenging thing in the whole project, and I mean it is still something that we very much think long and hard and kind of critically about. I don't know. I mean, what does it mean to be a white person with a camera, you know, in those situations, in those places? I think we all know what it means. I think we all know that, you know, we have power, or, you know, that there is this power quandary. But I also think that, like, what's starting to happen is that, you know, there is this, because of the sensitivity around ethics of representation, what we're starting to see is a kind of segregation of the gaze, okay? So white people should be only looking at white people, and what people of color should be looking at people of color. I think it's not that simple. And I also think if it comes to not just the racial question, but also to the question of material possibilities, I don't think that the poor or the impoverished or the oppressed should be left to tell their story or to represent themselves, because they really have a lot on. They really have a lot of struggle, and I think they should be helped. They should be supported, and they should be listened to. And listened to, I think, is the most important thing here. But I don't think they should be just left to their own devices, you know, or they should be co-opted to an art project just for a purpose of them being the, you know, the photographers that you train for 3 weeks and then you abandon the community. It's not in any way any healthier way of working. And I don't know if there is a, you know, like a golden solution to this problem, but I think it is important to be tapping at that issue, and because otherwise we don't get the representation of this really urgent situations. And I think there is also an idea of erasure, you know, there is just, we're just erasing the problem, right? If we're just afraid, if we're too sensitive to look, then it's gone, then it's not there. And then what that mean?
Mm-hmm. I have to say that I felt pretty comfortable with the image, with many images of the people you show in the film, because they are, for example, we've seen only them from the backside, yeah, or their backs, and or the faces, but from the distance, yeah. But there is one image, one film sequence which was really strong for me, with children in a slum, because it's a kind of like. Yeah, I was wondering why did you choose to show this sequence? Because basically we have just to explain it to the audience. We have children who are doing different things to the camera in the direction of a camera. So they are smiling, they're doing something, yeah, funny, or so. These are the images we know from yes, from journalism, from many documentaries, yeah, like this very almost stereotype images of global south, like this nameless children who wants to be visible, yeah. So this, I have to say, somehow reflect on me stronger than other sequences.
If I obviously I don't have the image in front of me now, but this is, if I understand correctly, it's a scene in a slum in Dhaka called Kalyanpur Basti. It's a slum which is based upon a lake, and so again we followed the same process to seek permission to film in this community, and we had wanted to film in this community because they suffer a lot of flooding during the monsoon. A lot of people will live with a foot of water inside their house and use bricks to prop up their beds so that they don't get wet in the night. And in doing so, we sought permission from the community leader, and we were accompanied by the research assistant we were working with there called Bocky, who had worked a lot in that basti, so he knew a lot of the community. And what actually happened to make that scene, which happens quite a lot, and we found a lot in Bangladesh, was that if ever we were walking, looking for people to speak to and to try and capture this phenomena, though it was not wet at this time, and we were ambushed in some ways. I don't think ambushed is the right word, but this group of children wanted to be filmed in this way. So we filmed, and the kids amassed, and then the performance happened. So it's an exchange. But absolutely, it is a pretty uncomfortable scene, and it is one which we have debated about whether or not we should remove. Do you have anything, any other thoughts?
I mean, I completely agree with you that there are definitely moments and kind of scenes that kind of remind us of those photojournalistic tropes. But at the same time, we kind of didn't feel like we wanted to censor that interaction too much. And we weren't thinking that it might kind of paint those children in a kind of negative way, or but I guess if it makes us think about how camera represents, then maybe that's why we wanted to kind of leave it, because a lot of what we do is kind of we try to ask this question, why is it so that the camera creates this othering, regardless of the intention, or regardless of the circumstances, or even regardless if the thing is staged or not staged. It always creates that feeling. And I think that feeling of kind of being disconnected or maybe hiding behind something, I think it really relates to our guilt about climate change and about what's happening. I just feel it kind of resonates and penetrates the kind of the soul in a similar way. And it's a difficult feeling. It's a difficult question, and I don't know if we are not complicit as artists with, in not resolving it, but at that stage we couldn't resolve it, I think, in ourselves even.
Thinking about the word ambushed is that we weren't ambushed. The people which we are filming are ambushed because we're coming into their community and filming. So what actually this scene perhaps represents more than anything is our presence in that community and how that presence makes other people feel, but also potentially inspires these performances, confrontations, and how that raises these questions about power dynamics.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you also about the structures you impose on the film, itself, because we are watching beautiful difficult, engaging images, which are telling us a story of climate change and its consequences. But at the same time, we have the structures you decided to put on this fact of watching film itself. So the film is 3-channeled projection. This is one of the formats you're showing the project. Another thing is that you had this 4 scenarios. You present the story in 4 scenarios. There are these 4 dots which are shown in 4 moments of the film. So they are talking about a few decades. I don't remember how many decades, 20 years, each dot is 20 years. So each dot depicts 20 years of changes of the future. So, and there is also another structure, color coding. There are 3 color codings which also provide another framework to understand the stories. So can you tell me more about this, why you decided on putting all of these layers on the fact of watching the film, and what do they mean for you and why they are important?
Absolutely. Everything is about trying to represent the multiplicity of pathways that we have to the future, and how those pathways are based upon the choices which we make. So when we present the different speculative scenario events, it is not one scenario, it is multiple events coming from different scenarios, often which contradict. So, for example, certainly as you get towards the end of the film, you have events which are extremely contradictory. You have, for example, I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but the suggestion of a climate-just future. Climate justice has prevailed, but you also have the suggestion that it is a very catastrophic world. So this is the 2 ends of the spectrum. And this again is represented, this is why we used colored dots instead of temperatures, because too hot is a subjective term based upon where you are. So too hot in the global south is 1.5 degrees, because if you're too below, your island is gone. I mean, that's the absolute threshold for how long too below can exist, is by sticking to 1.5 degrees. Whereas when you get to 6, it is catastrophic for everyone, including those who could have built walls, who could live in bunkers, who can live under geodesic domes or something. And so that's why we wanted people to interpret what is too hot for them, what can they live with as being too hot. When it comes to the different color coordinating of those speculative scenario events, we wanted to identify that there are different frameworks which we use as artists, but also scientists, researchers, journalists also use to look at the world. So I'm going to try and remember now, but we highlighted 3 particular different ways of looking at the world through different lenses. Lenses is the term used by researchers for these ways of looking at the world when undertaking a study. So we have green for a climate justice way of looking at the world, and therefore those events which are color-coded green relate to a climate justice framework of looking, but also events which would happen in a just future. Then we have blue for a technocratic future, or a technocratic way of looking at things, such as eco-modernist future scenarios in which things like geoengineering is used to solve the climate crisis.
Carbon capture storage.
Carbon capture storage, sulfur dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere, big walls being built around the countries which can afford it, new islands being made to replace Tuvalu. And then we have red for the neo-Malthusian way of looking. Now, Malthus was an old scholar who first thought, if we have too big a population, we're going to use too much resources, and then society is going to collapse. So those of us in contemporary society who still think this are called neo-Malthusians, and this is a very problematic way of looking at the world, because we don't have a problem with resources, we have a problem with the unequal distribution of resources. 1% of the world's population owns 70%, whereas the poorest 99 own 30% of the world. So this is a way of looking at the world which is lent upon by certain political areas, but people who tend to blame population rather than the way we do things in the world. And finally, the choice to use 3 screens was so that we could show multiple perspectives in the same way that scenarios thinking requires you to look at multiple perspectives of a given situation or an event. But also it was intended to imply multiple pathways to the future, but also purely to show the complexity of looking at the issue, looking at a given situation, and that so much is happening all at once when we talk about climate change. And we very much worked with climate change as under Timothy Morton's idea of a hyperobject, something which is massively distributed in space and time, which we can't see all at once. So this is a sort of pathetic attempt to try and see it all at once in this film.
I think we also started with 3 screens because you were thinking at past, present, and future. But then it got a bit more complicated because the past becomes the future, and the present is the future. And
unfortunately, I didn't have an opportunity to watch your film properly. Yeah, I did it at home, and I was trying to be very analytical. So I was counting how long are the film sequences, each film sequence, because I was trying to find a pattern, like general pattern for the film, and I noticed that it's you keep this rhythm of 1, 2, or 3 minute sequences, yeah. So you through out the entire film, so almost, yeah, there are specific moments when you have a longer sequences, yeah, but for most of the time I felt like I'm following really regular rhythm, yeah, of images which are next to which are appearing, yes, on my screen, and in this very immersive way of engaging me to your story. There were 2 moments which were for me something really different. So the beginning and the end, because of the music. And this is the thing I would like to ask you about, yeah, because it's also very, for me, important decision of how to include music to such films as you did, yeah. So you choose to put the music at the beginning and in the end, and in between we have only noises, sounds from the field, yeah, the field, the place where the shooting was.
Try to read into movie.
Well, you have to answer this question because you composed the music as well.
I guess I think the beginning of and end of a film are used to introduce a person to a certain way of looking and the way that the film operates, the cinematic or sound devices which are being used to create the cinematic, or in this case it's more than cinematic because it's installation-based world in which you're looking. And I think music is being used here to entice people to come and look at something which otherwise would be quite uneventful, because there is no talking, there's no explanations, there's no people telling you what to think. It is purely dependent upon you investing your time to interpret the images which you're seeing, like you say, in shots which are far longer than normal television documentary shots. So I think that's why the music is there. But it also, I think, music is there because we are representing a specific time period, and so we could just end abruptly, but time doesn't end. There's a lot of history before, and these events happen, and a lot of history will come afterwards. So potentially it's sort of just a way of saying, and then the world happens, or previously the world happened.
For me, it was a strategy so if you saw the installation in the actual form that it's meant to be seen, it's quite an immersive experience. The screens are fairly large and they're at an angle, so they're kind of spatially distributed in the space, and the viewer is really placed in the middle. So you can embrace the whole installation with your eyes, but at the same time, the screens are so big that you find yourself kind of not being really able to look at all of them at once. And also the sound in the installation, it's designed in such a way that each screen has got its own soundtrack, and it really draws your attention to which screen. We use it a lot. And for me, the music in the beginning and in the end is to bring you in and to bring you out from the immersion, from the experience. Yeah, but I think also for your mind to kind of like attune itself to this, without any expectations, and then to kind of let you arrive again at the reality. Maybe you don't need it, but it kind of, that kind of hygiene, I suppose. Yeah.
So I would like to thank you, Lena and Teo, for the conversation, and I would like to invite our audience to immerse in the story you prepared for the Photomonth festival, and go and see the film itself, because as you talk about this experience of 3-channeled projections is really different from mine very reduced experience of watching it at home. So I would like to invite you for the exhibition of Lena Dobrowolska and Teo Ormond-Skeaping, Future Scenarios, Tytano Kraków, Dolnych Młynów 10 Street, ulica. And the exhibition opening will be July 1st, and
I think it's July 3rd.
First, yeah, and the exhibition will last until July 19th. There is a free admission, so don't hesitate, go and watch this beautiful and very important film. And yeah, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank
your
you very much.
questions. Thank you for the conversation.